Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a Friday lunchtime session of M365 May, where I'll be taking you through the importance of Windows 10, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Microsoft Teams together. So my name is Loryan Strant, and I'll be taking you through this lovely journey of technology. Before we get started, I just want to go clicker go. Before we get started, I want my clicker to work. I guess that's not happening. All right then. Good little technical snafu to occur. Yeah, so I will have to progress things manually. We would like to pay our respects to the traditional owners of this land that we are presenting on virtually, be you in Australia or New Zealand. I won't read out the text as I don't feel I'll do it respect, but we do pay our respects to those, to the land. And also there's a code of conduct here. So in short, be nice to each other. That also means I have to be nice to you too. I hope I would be in general, yeah, be nice to each other. And I think that should be something that we have in general. But that code of conduct is online. As one of the organisers of the event, if you do see any issue with one of the sessions or how things have been done, or somebody breaching that code of conduct, please do let me know. So a little bit briefly about myself. So as I said, my name is Loryan Strant. I have been working with these technologies for a long time, since before they were known as, well, now Microsoft 365, then it was Office 365, then it was, before that it was BPOS, and before that it was server stuff that I was working on. So I've been working with these technologies a long time, and I've seen them evolve quite a lot over the years. In terms of my style, I will tell anecdotes. I will potentially go off on tangents because, yeah, I've got ADHD and I tend to go off in different directions. So makes sense to me, hopefully makes sense to you as we go through it. There might be some colourful language in there. I try to remain professional. But look, one of the things that I would say is important is I live and breathe this technology. So when I speak about it with passion, with energy, because it's something I fervently believe in. And I've got a lot of experience working with different organizations over the years that I will be sharing with you and bringing to you. So the first thing is what is so important about WAST? So WAST stands for Windows, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams. Now, why are these all important? For some people it might be obvious. The main reason why I'd say they're important is because from an end user perspective, excuse me, I've had a spicy lunch right before coming on, not a smart choice, is all of these things have to work together. Yes, you can use OneDrive without the rest. You can use SharePoint without the rest. You can use Windows 10 without the rest. And you can use Microsoft Teams, not really without the rest, but to a certain point. But the thing is, together, and with people actually understanding how the technologies work together and how to get the best out of them, that's where it actually starts to make the difference and actually improves end users. Why is Windows 10 important to Microsoft Teams? Well, you're going to see that today. So let's start firstly with where Microsoft Teams fails users. So the first one here is where people want to work together with just a group of people and a few files. So what do? They create a team because, well, it makes sense. That's what a team is for. It's working with a few people, you know, on a series of files. Another scenario might be where they want to share some files with people who are outside of their team. So I'm in team A, someone's in team B, and I want to share files with them, but I don't want to add them into team A. So I create team C and we both join and copy those files across. Another scenario is where people lose their work. So they're sitting there having a conversation, a message pops up and they click on it and they respond to it. And they get quite frustrated because they've lost their work and now they've got to go back to the team, back to the channel, back to the tab, back to the file, and find that file again and keep going. Also, the big challenge for people is that they can't access Microsoft Teams offline. So we're used to working with files in a certain way and everything's in Teams, everything's in the cloud. Well, what happens when the cloud is offline? Now, the cloud could be offline for service issues, or it could be because I'm on a plane when we're allowed to get back on those things again. So I want to still be able to access my work, but a lot of people, they think it's in Teams, therefore I have to be in Teams to access that file. A big one as well is when people are working within Microsoft Teams and they click on it, they go, oh, it doesn't have the full functionality of Word or Excel or PowerPoint. It's just a cut down version in Teams. Like, yes, it is. That's what it's not the full version of Word. It is the Teams version of it. Or where they find working on a document is actually quite slow because the refresh rate, or as they move through things, or co-authoring, it's just not working well. And again, it's because they're working through the Microsoft Teams interface. Now, by no means am I saying that Microsoft Teams is the problem here. So that's the thing, is from an end user perspective, they blame Microsoft Teams because it's the thing that doesn't work for them. It's the issue, it's the application that's in front of them that just is failing them, whether it's, as I said, being able to work offline or it's too hard to do something. Again, the user blames the tool that's in front of them. They don't blame SharePoint behind the scenes or OneDrive or their IT admin. They blame Teams. So let's cover some basics about WAST and what these things give us. So Windows 10 gives us File Explorer, something we've used since 1992 when it was File Manager in Windows 3.1. And actually, if you want to really go far back, you've got things like Xtree Gold that some people use and those kind of things, but it gives us that graphical user experience from a file management perspective. We've then got OneDrive, which should have detected that one before I pressed go, but it's cropped it to fit instead of, or to fill instead of fit. But OneDrive gives us not just a pocket of content and place for our files to store that are like our home drive, it's actually an entry point into all files across SharePoint, but even in Microsoft 365 in general. And it also gives us a synchronization engine on our desktops. So it is the thing that actually pulls files down from other places. SharePoint gives us the platform behind Microsoft Teams for the document libraries and other content that also gets stored inside of Microsoft Teams. Not all of it, but some of it, such as your wiki and those kind of things are also stored there. So that's the thing, is SharePoint is important. And I hear this all the time where organizations say, oh, yeah, look, we hate SharePoint. We're moving away from it. We're going to use Teams. You're going to keep using SharePoint. Or we don't want to use SharePoint. We want to use Teams. You're using SharePoint. You have no choice. Sure, maybe you're not using the front screen, the front, the web browser, but you also can't stop people from using it once they're in Teams. And then obviously we have Microsoft Teams that gives us that end user experience with the chats, the channels, the calls, the meetings, everything in the one experience. So the first thing we need to kind of address when we think about how all this stuff stitches together is the channels that we have inside of a team are actually folders in a SharePoint library. So in every team, you get a group behind the scenes, which is now called a Microsoft 365 group. You will then get inside of that group will also be attached a SharePoint site collection with a site inside of it and a document library inside of that. And that is what is powering the files functionality inside of Teams. So this is important to note that these files, as I said, they're in SharePoint regardless. So if we then think, okay, hang on a sec, Loryan's jumping all over the place. Bear with me, this stitches together. So if we think that, okay, we now understand that channels are actually folders inside of a SharePoint document library. If we then think about Windows 10 and since its release date, so we've got build 1507, which is when it first came out. There's been some builds since then. Oh, there's 1709. We'll come back to that one shortly. But effectively, we end up, which is, excuse me, 1909, which is actually where we're at today. Soon that'll actually be build to 2004. But at the moment, we're build 1909. But build 1709 is the one that I care about and the one that you should care about. It doesn't say it's the best one, it's the one we should be on, but it's the one that is important to us. Now, why is it important to us? The reason being is because over time, the synchronization experience within Windows and Mac as well, but we're sticking to Windows here, has changed. So historically, we used to have SkyDrive Pro before it was OneDrive for Business. And so we had a synchronization engine that we could point to a SharePoint server location or SharePoint Online location, and we could synchronize all the files. Then when that was rebadged, it was then updated. It became OneDrive for Business. It was still the same functionality, the same experience behind the scenes. Now, why was this a bad thing? Because when it synchronized, it would synchronize everything, unless we as a user went in and did what we call selective folder sync. We would say, no, I don't want to synchronize that one. I don't want to synchronize that one. I don't want to synchronize that one. So the challenge was that users had to be dependent. So we had to be dependent on users to actually make smarter choices, to understand, and also to be vigilant. Because the problem would be is if one person came in and dumped a 10 gigabyte file into the SharePoint document library, everybody's machine would pull that file down. So that would hamper your network. It also consume your disk space. So this is the challenge that we had, is everything that was there was here unless I told it otherwise. However, with build 1709 of Windows 10, but OneDrive is actually the experience that's powering it, we have what we call files on demand. So we've had this in Windows 8 briefly when it was called something else. Can't remember what they were called. Bookmarks, no, something else. Anyway, but what this effectively does is gives us files that are available online, they're available temporarily offline or permanently offline, depending on what we set. Now, this is different from disk management because this is the opposite way. Instead of everything being on my hard drive and I have to say what shouldn't be on my hard drive, instead, this is nothing is on my hard drive until I say I want it to be on my hard drive. And the way that that works is I can either open the file, which means it temporarily pulls it down, and then something like Windows 10 Storage Sense will say after 30 days, you haven't accessed this file, I'm removing it from your drive, but it's still there in the cloud. Or I will say, I want these folders to be always, or these files to be always on my machine because I'm accessing them regularly. So therefore, I want it to be fast and easy access for me. I don't want to have to bother downloading from the cloud. But again, hang on, I'm talking about Teams. So why are we talking about File Explorer? So the challenge is that we talked about before where Teams fails users, but the reality is it's actually often IT. And if you're an IT pro in here who is responsible for running their network, feel free to meet me in the car park after we're allowed to, and we can have a lovely professional conversation about why you maybe have an issue with my assertions here. But the reality is this is what I see from working with customers. So the first one is I see clients that and organizations that are running older builds of Windows 10. They're few and far between, but I still do see them, or Windows 7 even worse, or Windows XP, in which case that's just dangerous territory. But that's the thing is, so I see older builds of that where we don't have that functionality. Or I see Microsoft Teams deployments where where OneDrive hasn't actually been made available, or has been made available, but the client hasn't been deployed, or the client has been configured to automatically synchronize. So what happens is a user sees the OneDrive pop up, doesn't know what it is because it was just pushed out at some point, and they just close it and they never sign in. And then they'll complain that they can never access their files offline. To which IT will say, well, why didn't you sign in? I didn't know what it meant. Whole change management conversation comes into it. Because training hasn't been provided on how to use OneDrive. Because a lot of times when we do training on OneDrive, it's, hey, this is coming, we're moving your home drives, off you go. Or some basics of your files were here, now they're here. OneDrive's a little bit different on that. And people, if they're not trained on it, are not really made aware of how to actually use it to their fullest. So the reality is how many people are actually shown how to actually synchronize files and folders from their OneDrive to their local machine and keep them online, but also then how many people are shown how to use Windows 10, the ability to favorite certain folders that might be in your OneDrive, so that they're always available at the top in File Explorer. No, because we don't think about that. We just do the basics of OneDrive training, not the full picture, or no training at all. When we come to things like Microsoft Teams, as I said, it sits on top of SharePoint from a files perspective. People aren't trained on the difference between OneDrive and SharePoint. Now, I'm not saying that people have to be trained on SharePoint to be full SharePoint enterprise administrators or full even site owners, but they need to understand that SharePoint is the shared drive and OneDrive is my drive. But they need to understand where the synchronization engine fits in, where the OneDrive portal fits in, how I can use that to access content in SharePoint, how I can use it to synchronize content in SharePoint, but also that content in SharePoint is everybody who's a member of this particular team can actually see that particular content. So they're not really trained on the difference. And so what happens is people will take files, put them into their OneDrive, share it with their team, and that becomes now the drive. I have literally seen people do that where OneDrive has been made available to them and they have taken their HR drive, stuck it in OneDrive and gone, hey team, this is where all our files are now. That's a little bit dangerous. And so, yeah, the kind of final point here is that users aren't aware that channels in Teams are folders in SharePoint. So this is kind of a little bit of a big deal, and it's important that we this is fully understood by users because they need to understand what they're dealing with behind the scenes. It's all very well and good to show people how to put files in Teams, but they need to understand that the service powering those files is actually something else, and that something else works in a particular way that can do a lot of things for them. So how do we make this easy for end users? So we can actually map network drives, for want of a better term, to end users. So what I mean by that is we can actually map locations from a SharePoint document library to end users. Now, we're not saying we're pushing all the files, we're simply making it available for them to access like their OneDrive. So one way of doing this is through the use of group policy. We can also use Intune or Endpoint Manager, as it's called now. Other MDM solutions are out there. We can map solutions through using PowerShell, if you like. We can also use a registry editor if you really want to get into unsupported territory. And at this point, the Office Cloud Policy service doesn't actually support what I'm about to show you because it is a flat structure from a settings perspective. So it doesn't support yes, and here's the value. It only supports yes or value. So at this point, it doesn't support the ability to actually bring SharePoint document libraries down to my machine. So one of the things before I show you how we're going to do, how we can achieve this, is that a relatively recent-ish addition. Some people have had it longer than others. It rolled out, it was paused, then it was rolled out again, is the sync button in Microsoft Teams. So people need to understand that that sync button will sync SharePoint files using the OneDrive sync engine to their machine. So straight away, we're already using two different products here that the user is not familiar with because they only know Teams. That's all they've been shown, if shown anything at all. So they need to understand, what does that sync button do? They need to understand that if I go into a channel and I press sync, that will only synchronize the channel. So maybe a better approach is I can actually synchronize the entire document library so that I can see all the channels instead of just that particular one. Otherwise, they'll go into every channel, they'll press sync, and then they'll have this huge listing in File Explorer, and it's just unmanageable. Oh, it's just such a pain to use. Well, how about I show you a different way? So again, we need to think about this. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment, take a sip, because as I said, I ate some spicy lunch before I started. Get your phones out, take a picture of that, go enter some prizes, which are actually sitting next to me, but I'm not going to show them while I have a sip. Refreshing. Oh, Microsoft Teams water bottle. Right, hopefully you've all got it open and you've done your submissions and you're entering, and I say good luck to you. So what I'm going to do is give you a bit of a demonstration about how we can use Endpoint Manager, formerly known as Intune, to actually map network drives, so SharePoint document library, to end users. Now, what I'm about to show you is the first experience, which is user comes on board and they are, they log in, they don't actually have, nothing's been mapped for them. So they log into their machine, they go to File Explorer. Oh, wait, hang on, OneDrive, if I click on it, it's grayed out, it's not signed in. There's no drives here because everything's in the cloud. And if I click on OneDrive, they're told to set it up, which is not a great experience because again, they'll look at it and go, what am I supposed to do here? I don't know this, and they'll just close it. So if we go into Endpoint Manager, we can actually, for starters, configure a lot of this, but I'm not going to show that part, but we can definitely configure things like files on demand, known folder move, but most importantly, the OneDrive sign-in. But what I'm going to show here in this demo is that we're going to go into Endpoint Manager and we're going to create a, we're going to use the policy to actually deploy a SharePoint team site document library that's inside of a Microsoft team to an end user through the OneDrive client. So effectively, we go into this policy, into this administrative template. You can add it to an existing one or create a dedicated one. And there's a particular variable we need to get to. So here we go. I forgot my own demo. So we are going to set them to automatically sign in because we want it to be a good experience. So it will take the credentials that it understands. Hopefully your identity system is set up well and working. We will now make sure that it's using files on demand, not synchronizing everything. So users can make that choice. And this is where we're now going to synchronize the team libraries for them. So we're actually going to go in, we select, we're going to enable it, and this is where we start putting the value in. Now the value is something we get from the SharePoint library itself. How we do that is we press the sync button and it pops up. Now, instead of opening the OneDrive sync client, we actually copy the URL that it gives us. There is a button there where you can, or text that you can hover over, click and go copy, which I'm doing there. And then we can simply paste it in and that will come down. Now, obviously we need to assign this new configuration to end users. And one thing to note is that it will take up to 8 hours to actually apply to the end users. So don't expect that you can actually configure it and then walk away and it will work straight away. Generally do it, give it a night before it'll actually be applied. This is actually quite frustrating for testing purposes because I can tell you that demo took me an entire weekend to get going because I did it, I made a typo, and then I had to wait 8 hours for that typo to be rectified. Now on that, the library ID, excuse me, the library ID value that you'll get when you copy that link will actually have a bunch of different variables in it, like a %2D you need to replace with a dash. %7B needs to be a squiggly open bracket thing that if I remember my maths from school, I'd remember what it's called. So there's a number of different variables you'll need to replace with the actual characters. It's just how it's formatted. It's a little bit frustrating, but it's quite easy to do. Now, if I then go back to our friend Adrian and we say, what's his experience look like now? He will now sign in. And again, we're using a device that's connected to Azure AD, that's using Endpoint Manager. There's his Teams, there's all these different channels. If he clicks on File Explorer, OneDrive is already signed in. And look, there's those particular channels from those document libraries, which are actually the Teams. So he can then choose to say, I want to make this available offline all the time. So this is a really simple thing to do. What I would say though is what I've just demonstrated is not something you do for every single team. It's just not manageable. What you would do it for is organizational based teams. And what I mean by that is structured teams based on your org chart. So if this team of people has a shared drive like HR, like accounts, like legal, whatever it might be, pick that up, move it into Teams, and simply use this particular method to map that drive for them so they can continue working as is. The thing is, you don't even have to push Teams out to them. You can be preparing to get them to use Teams, but they're not actually ready to do it yet. But you can still put that there, not give them the Teams application, but put their files into that kind of structure and use this particular method to push that out. So you can effectively migrate their files to Teams, but it's actually to SharePoint. And realistically, all that happens is S drive now becomes a little icon of a building. They go into it and there's their particular folders that they had access to before. So straight away, it's a better experience because as well as that, even if they're offline, they will see the structure of files, which is something they wouldn't be able to do with a network file share. So already in a better state. So if we have a think about why this is important, why do we care about File Explorer? Why do we care about the Windows experience? Everything's done in Teams. We're all in the Teams application. We're all in the web. Why do we care about File Explorer? Because if you have a think about it, this is File Manager from Windows 3.1, as I mentioned before, circa 1992. And this is where most people, or Gen Xers and baby boomers and the like, where they started using the graphical user interface and actually navigating their files this way. So think about flash forward then to 2015 when Windows 10 was released. And what we have here is File Explorer in Windows 10. Pretty much the same thing with a coat of paint. Yes, the file names are longer and folder names, and yes, there's a few other things we can do, but the reality is this is how a lot of people still access their files. So if you're trying to get them to Microsoft Teams, that's a gigantic change. Getting them to SharePoint, gigantic change. Even OneDrive is not a small change. But what this allows us to do is to move the files into the place where we want them to be, but still keep the experience relatively the same as what they're used to. What that means is our change management efforts are greatly reduced. Also means we can do things in a smaller stage. We can slowly increase new functionality, awareness and function and features to them, so they can go, oh, I didn't realize these were already in the cloud. Now let's actually go have a look at them over here. And maybe you start getting crazy and doing metadata and those kind of things and start sharing links instead of sending attachments. So as I said, I work with a lot of organizations on a daily basis, and I see a lot of different scenarios. Where we've gone wrong, myself included, is we trained people incorrectly because we trained them once. We said, here's OneDrive, this is how it works, these are the features. Bye-bye, good luck using it. But that doesn't work because, you know what, in the early days of Office 365, yeah, the updates weren't thick and fast like they are now, but now there's new features rolling out across the platform every day. So it's not to say that OneDrive gets new features every day, but you can be sure that it gets new features every month. Do we train our users every month on that? No, we don't. So that's the thing, is simply providing one training goat, it's not sufficient. We trained people on just the products. So, you know, we trained them on OneDrive, we trained them on SharePoint, we trained them on Teams. We didn't train them on the entire thing and why it's important, why you need to understand things from in SharePoint to support your usage of Microsoft Teams. And the reality is we also still keep working the old ways. We are stuck in our comfort zone. I will quite openly say that 98% of the time, I use File Explorer to get to the files that I want. The other 1% of the time, I would probably go into the application like PowerPoint, Word or Excel and look at recent file history. And the other 1% would actually be to go into Teams and open the file that way. But I love File Explorer, it just works for me. It's muscle memory, it's just a way that works. So it's, and if you can imagine, I live and breathe this technology. Imagine people who don't live and breathe, who don't want to change. Try taking this tool away from them, because that's what happens a lot of the time. We say, you're in SharePoint now, you're in Teams, and we take away their map drive that they've been using their entire career and expect them to be happy with this new way of working. So the problem is we need to start with a strong foundation. We need to start with the Windows training. So you need to understand how to actually do things like favoriting folders and make them quickly available to you, so that I don't have to go into the building icon, expand it, find, and go down, 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 down. If I'm working on a particular file regularly, I can take that folder location and go add it to my quick launch in File Explorer, and there it is. Makes it a lot easier for me to access it every time. We need to understand OneDrive because we need to understand things like version control. That's a really great feature. We need to understand co-authoring. We need to understand sharing links instead of sending attachments and permissions, and where it's appropriate to share a link internally, externally, those kind of things, and what kind of permissions need to be applied. And also we need to understand working in the web versus the desktop applications and the difference between them. So going back to that first point, or the earlier point of working inside of Teams, you're actually working in the web versions of the apps just inside of Teams. So yeah, it's not as fully featured, but there's things that I can do in them that I can't do in the desktop. Like PowerPoint, for example, I can do Presenter Coach in files if I use the web version, but not the desktop version. So we actually need to explain to and train our users that between OneDrive and SharePoint, we have different experiences, but we also need to understand how to work together as a team, not just here's my file, I email it to you, because that's what we used to. We used to point and click. We used to aim it at a direction and away you go, but that's not how we really work these days. We need to work a little bit more openly, but also be more comfortable to say, I'm putting this file here, here's where I want people to access it, but also to be able to say, I've started a file in OneDrive, now it has a place to belong in SharePoint, or it should go to this location, move the file. Because when you move it, it takes your version history with you, instead of just cut and paste, where it'll just lose everything. And finally, we need to understand Teams and how it sits on top of all of these. So we need to understand why I want to use Teams on the desktop, why I can press the sync button, why it might be better to press the sync button from SharePoint as opposed to from the channel itself. So we need to bring all these bits together. And if people actually understand what these things are, then they'll know that they shouldn't press the sync button at the channel level and then go into the SharePoint site several months later and do it at the site level as well, because they're now going to have the same files in 2 different locations on their machine. So how this actually helps, so how WAST helps, Windows, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams. So we can effectively, as I said before, allow people to continue working the way they have for 20 odd years, which is File Explorer. Don't rip it away from them, because that's how they want to work. Doesn't mean they have to stay there forever, but just don't take it away from them. So when we move our S drive, we don't have to say, bye-bye File Explorer, you don't access files that way anymore. It does allow us to also move files to the cloud. So as I said, you can start preparing for Teams or preparing for doing more advanced things in SharePoint. It doesn't mean you have to take everything and transform it overnight. It means you can actually just pick the files up, lift and shift, move them, and then clean them up later, apply metadata, whatever. I'm not saying that you definitely do the lift and shift, just saying there are, that's one way you could potentially do it. It also means we can move files without a giant cost, because we've got things like the SharePoint migration tool that allows us to migrate files for free. Also, you can simply redirect people's folders from their My Documents on their desktop PC to their OneDrive location, and it will move. So no partner involved, no tooling involved, just a bit of bandwidth. As long as you plan it well, it'll run smoothly. So you can do this stuff really easy and more cost effective. And we can also introduce change slowly, because no, I'm not saying that our end users are as slow as turtles, but there's a lot of change happening right now. There is a lot of, not just COVID, but in general, things are iterating, things are adapting, things are evolving so quickly. We can't expect our users to keep up with the technology just because, well, this is how it is, because our IT departments can't keep up with the technology. New features arrive all the time that they're not aware of. So how can we expect end users to be aware of it? So if we think back, how strong is your foundation? Have you got your Windows 10 build 1709 or above deployed? And have people been trained on how to use File Explorer better than how they used to? Have we got OneDrive deployed, the sync engine pushed out, actually connected, and people trained on how to use OneDrive beyond just dump your files here and share and away you go? Have people actually been trained on how to use SharePoint? Because you know what, a lot of people hate SharePoint. It's been around for almost 20 years and it's been kicked a lot over the years. I've been working with it since 2001. I've seen it change a lot, but a lot of people haven't. They worked with it 6 years ago, so they still think it sucks. So we need to explain to them and show them it's actually not that bad. It's actually improved quite a lot. It's very end user friendly. So we need to show them that here's how these things can work. And what this also helps us with is to actually get that Microsoft Teams adoption working. So ultimately, all these things work well because we talk about adoption. Yeah, but the problem is we don't have a strong foundation to base it on. So sure, you can roll out Teams and do great training, but if people don't understand the underlying things, they're not going to have this thumbs up experience. They're just going to be frustrated. So with that, I will open the floor to any questions. I have gone over time, so thank you for bearing with me. Someone has said, the gotcha with the copying of the library ID is you need to do it with a global or SharePoint admin account, otherwise it doesn't show. I'm not sure that's the case, because I think I did it as an end user who was the site owner. However, I'm not going to debate that. If that's the case, then yes, get an administrator to do it. The reality is you're probably going to be copying the site ID as an admin anyway, but if that is the case, then great tip. Any other questions while I stand here awkwardly? In the interim, while I stand here awkwardly waiting for questions, I will say thank you to our sponsors who have made this conference possible, because despite being online and using these amazing tools, there are still costs behind the scenes for this. So thank you to the sponsors for making all this work and for helping us out. So I will awkwardly take another drink of water if there are any more questions to come through. Vicky has a question of, will this pack be made available? Yes, it will be. It actually already is. But you can, it'll be available on this particular site afterwards as well. So yeah, I can't remember exactly how we've got it, but at some point the page will refresh and we'll have the link to the URL as well as the recording. Any other questions? Why am I wearing a Yammer top while doing a Teams presentation? Nobody asked, so I'm not going to answer it. But if there's no other questions coming through, I will say thank you very much for your time. Have a great Friday afternoon. Whoa, quick question. Did you mention what Office 365 licenses are required to get Azure Active Directory Windows 10 policies? They're not actually Office 365 licenses. You require Endpoint Manager. So that is part of, you cannot buy that as a standalone, or you can get it as part of the Enterprise Mobile Security or Enterprise Mobility Security, whatever that EMS bundle is called, or under the Microsoft 365 package that includes all of it. But yeah, that's Endpoint Manager that allows you to do that, that pushing out of the drive aspect of the drive. Someone else has asked, would it be possible to get a copy of the presentation? Yes, as answered before. Any other questions? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Have a great Friday afternoon. Thank you for attending our conference, and I will see you at some point in the future, I hope.